continuing. That's awesome to hear. While we wait for just a minute, I did want to point out, I'm going to start and go over a little Zoom tutorial, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to let me know. I also want to put in a plug for future events, especially since this talk today deals so much with space. I wanted to put a call out for any of our artists who are on the call, our art enthusiasts. We have another event later today called The Artist is In. I'll drop a line in the chat in a second. But they're looking at how artists are adapting to this moment that we're all in. And so it's a community of artists who meet each Wednesday afternoon. And today's topic is actually on space. So what are we doing now that our studio spaces or maybe our kitchen table or our collaborators are in virtual space? So something to definitely check out if you're interested in those sort of conversations. And here, let me drop that in real quick. I think, Brittany, if you're all right with it, I might say we get started in just a second, if that's okay.
Sure, yep, we're ready.
Lovely, all right. Thank you everyone for being here. It's so nice to see all 44 of you here today for another Art at Noon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Abby King. I'm the Assistant Director of Adult Programming here at PAFA, and I facilitate these live events that we have each week. I wanted to start the program off the way I normally do, with a big thank you to our PAFA members for coming out and supporting us today and every day. Thank you for being here, and if you haven't already, please consider joining. And just again, thank you to everybody, maybe not members or members. It's so nice to see all of you with us today. Many of you are returning folks, so you know what's about to happen. I'm just going to do a quick Zoom overview. So just how we're going to facilitate today's program. I'm going to start off by muting everybody except Brittany. And so I'm doing this just, I'm going to ask that in the way that we used to silence our cell phones, that we silence our Zoom screens. So the majority of this program, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Brittany Webb. She's going to be sharing her screen. And it's really important that you stay muted while she's speaking, because otherwise Zoom will try to assume that it knows who's speaking. So I am going to ask you to stay on mute. That's not to say we don't want to hear from you. We really do. Feel free to utilize the chat function. Like for now, I can see we already have somebody maybe with a Zoom question here, and I will get to that shortly. But if you have links or questions, thoughts, please feel free to drop it in the chat. We love hearing from you. I'm also going to mention that at the end of the program, we will have time for questions and answers, our Q&A, and we are going to ask you to virtually raise your hand. So the way you do that is at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a computer, it will say participants. So it's a little bit over from that mute button that I'm going to ask you to stay muted. And then right next to it is the camera button. If we can't see you on here and you want to be able to be seen, if you click that again, where there's not a red line, then your icon should show up. But then just a couple over from there, it says participants. When you click on that on the right-hand side of your computer screen, it'll pop up. You'll be able to see where it says virtually raise hand. So we're going to ask you to do that for the Q&A, or if anybody has trouble, feel free just to kind of wave at us, but it is a little bit easier since there's so many people on the call if you virtually raise your hand that way. Other than that, I want to mention that we are recording today's program. That's probably the #1 question I get asked the most is, I missed this. I had a meeting. I was taking care of my kids, which I think directly relates to what we're going to be talking about. So we want to make sure that this program is available later for folks. So if that makes you uncomfortable, you don't want to be on film, feel free to mute your camera button. So at the bottom of your screen next to that microphone button, if you click on that again, you won't be on the film or on the video of this program today. I'll also mention, unless you're actively asking a question, you probably won't be on the recording, but just in case, that's one precaution that you can take. Other than that, again, we do want to hear from you at the end of the program, so please feel free to put those questions, those thoughts. I'm so excited today that we're we're facilitating, or that we're hosting this program. I think it's such an important topic as we think about our lives in this moment and what our domestic spaces mean to us. And now it's my pleasure to hand it over to PAFA's curator of the John Roden Collection, Dr. Brittany Webb. Welcome, Brittany, and welcome to all of you. Unmute you.
Great. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today to talk about gendered labor and taking space. I think this is something that my co-curator, Jody Throckmorton, and I have been thinking about for a long time, but particularly with this exhibition. And there's a way that the coronavirus and what it means for this moment in the world and in our field has, I think, forced us to reconsider the work. There's a lot of work in this exhibition that looks a little different now. So I thought it might be a great jumping off point to have a conversation with some folks about it today. Give me a second to share my screen.
I also wanted to mention, for anyone who's having trouble, sorry to interrupt, trouble seeing Brittany, I'm going to ask you to pin her video. So since there's 45 people on the call, I always forget something. If you hover over Brittany's little square, there's 3 dots. If you click on those dots, it'll come down where you'll have a menu option and you can click pin video. So if you do that, it doesn't matter who else pops up, you will see her in the chat. So I'm going to recommend that you do that. And then you might also have to click switch sharing content so that you can see her PowerPoint large, but also still see her. So. Anyway, sorry, back to you, Brittany.
Oh, sure. So I'll start here. This title image feels perfect for this talk and for this moment, for so many conversations that I'm having with colleagues in the field and not in the field right now, just thinking about what gender and labor look like in this moment. So we have been thinking about gendered labor for a long time. This is a subject that's been on my mind since grad school. I was thinking about listening to my fellow grad students and fledgling academics try to balance home, work, school, family, research, teaching, and grant writing. I think about us huddling together after classes, at book talks and conferences, asking each other, how is all of this supposed to go? We read acknowledgement sections of books where writers thanked foundations for money, thanked other scholars for mentoring and editing, thanked wives for typing manuscripts. We listened to elder scholars talk about how much more restrictive our fields used to be, how they strategized having kids along academic calendars or hid them all together. Mothers talked about how the geographic expanse of their research changed when their lives couldn't accommodate them being all over the world for large stretches of time, or where they didn't have the same financial resources to sink into their work. Fathers did not talk about this. The New York Times has been covering the coronavirus labor as one where millions of essential workers are women. Many of those caring for the ill and the vulnerable are women. And this past weekend, for the first time, they used the word she session, quoting the president and chief executive of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, saying in response to this recession that we should go ahead and call it a she session. This is in contrast to the 2008 recession, which is sort of referred to as a man session. In this moment, the current economic crisis is described as unlike anything we've seen since the Great Depression. And for the first time in decades, this crisis has a predominantly non-white female face. Women accounted for, I'm quoting the writer Alicia Haridasani Gupta now, women accounted for 55% of the 20.5 million jobs lost in April, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, raising the unemployment rate for adult women to about 15% from 3.1% in February. In comparison, the unemployment rate for adult men was 13%. I have been thinking about how this medical, political, economic crisis is going to impact women in the arts. Like many fields during the pandemic, our field is contracting right now. As we lose people, institutions, funding, and futures, and not just here in Philadelphia. Because art is a creative and aesthetically interesting practice, it's a kind of work that doesn't always look like work to people who don't think about how they've never lived in a world without art. But art is work. Art making is creative, intellectual, and physical labor. And so I've been thinking about this with several writers in the context of this exhibition, and I think that it gives it a different kind of contemporary relevance. So we were thinking initially with the anthropologist Amy Meredith Cox, who edited a volume on gender and space, and in her introduction notes how gender structures and is structured by space. So she says, space can be a tangible material geography created through processes of mapping and demarcation. Space can be impalpable, sustained by ideas, beliefs, and practices that define identities and establish invisible yet powerful boundaries. Space is everywhere. It surrounds us like air, and just as organically inhaling and exhaling establishes the dynamic, expansive, and constricting context for life and death. Human beings attempt to locate and structure space as space locates and structures human beings. I've been thinking with Judith Butler, who pushes us to consider what gender is and how we make it, with Virginia Woolf, whose insistence that, quote, a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction, anchored nearly a century of thought around the material conditions of productive creativity for women and the need for time, solitude, and money. And with this exhibition, with Helen Molesworth, whose thoughts on building the competency of interpretation for audiences and institutions is part of her practice as an arts professional. In How to Install Art as a Feminist, she asks, is it a revolution of the deepest order to insert women artists back into rooms that have been structured by their very absence? What would it mean to take this absence as the very historical condition under which the work of women artists is both produced and understood? And so part of this is how we think about exhibitions where on the one hand, you want to show the work of women artists who have been historically absent in the history of museum exhibitions. This is not in dispute. There's a lot of statistics on this. There's been a lot of press on this lately. And on the other hand, what does it look like for two women curators to want to do a show about women artists, keeping in mind the critiques of, you know, what it means to do a show of all women artists, that sort of tack back and forth of how do you think through historical absence on the one hand, and the push against a kind of ghettoizing work by these artists who have been historically absent on the other. But I also want to point out the importance of the permanent collection. And so in thinking with Molesworth on the idea that absence is a historical condition under which the work of so many women artists is produced and understood, it matters that Taking Space is an exhibition built from the permanent collection, where it will be housed and available for exhibition and study long after everyone who sees this exhibition has passed away. We take this for granted about museum collections, but I think it bears articulating in this moment when there's so much anxiety in our field about whether or not institutional attention to women and their work is going to last beyond this moment of temporary exhibitions and scholarly projects. There's been a lot of press in the past few years about museum exhibition and collecting building initiatives designed to make up for this century of overlook. And so part of what makes this exhibition possible is, one, years of women artists making thoughtful work, sometimes in unsupportive communities and art schools, and frequently without the resources they need. Art spaces willing to show the work. Scholars and critics writing thoughtfully about the work. Individuals and institutions to financially support the work. and museum professionals who use their expertise to ensure that the work is exhibited, acquired, preserved for future generations, with an eye on how their contemporary work can enable more expansive art histories decades from now. All of this is work. All of this is gendered invisible labor for a lot of viewers. And the arts in particular are described as a pink collar field. So this is a field with a lot of women. But I think that's the subject for another talk. So our current cultural reckoning about work seems like an apt moment to consider how artists work and what's at work in the art in this exhibition, because so much work on the checklist looks different to us now. So this is a closer look that is by no means comprehensive at some of the work in Taking Space that will go on view when we can all gather together in space again. The overall exhibition takes space and scale as a point of entry to think about the artwork in a number of ways, including the artist's interaction with geography, seriality, and the body. And so this first slice of work I want to look at today is something that might fall under the heading of some assembly required, which I think of as artworks whose installation, their very mounting in the galleries, requires us in the museum to mobilize labor, installers, preps, framers, in a way that rehearse some of the artist's physical labor in making the work and forces us to think about that labor as we mobilize our own labor to bring it to public view. So I'll start with Louise Nevelson. So renowned sculptor Louise Nevelson experimented with found objects in her practice. Born near Kiev, Nevelson moved to the United States as a child and grew up in Maine, eventually attending school at the Art Students League in New York, working as an assistant for Diego Rivera, and teaching art supported by the Works Progress Administration. She had her first solo exhibition in 1941, and her major museum acquisitions began in the 1950s. Nevelson worked in an array of assembled materials, found materials, lumber, spindles, spools, columns, plain woods, and stacked objects and fragments into a number of totemic structures or poles in her work. There are two sculptures by Louise Nevelson in Taking Space, but I want to focus on Cascades Perpendiculars 1, because it's the first in a series that Nevelson undertook in 1982. The sculptures are constructed from the remnants of an organ from St. Mark's in the Bowery Church on the Lower East Side of New York. In 1978, St. Mark's Church was destroyed by a fire. The organ pipes from the church were salvaged from the fire and stored in the basement. The church eventually donated the pipes to Nevelson, who used them as a basis for this ambitious series of wooden sculptures. Nevelson exhibited this work in a show at Pace Gallery in 1983, and this is a series that spanned 20 sculptures. And when this went on view in 1983, Louise Nevelson was 82 years old. This is a remarkable age to be making this kind of body of work. This sculpture series was 20 works in black wood, and black is a color that Louise Nevelson worked in often enough that critics frequently focused on it in her practice. She said of the color, "When I fell in love with black, it contained all color." It wasn't a negation of color. It was an acceptance. Because black encompasses all colors, black is the most aristocratic color of all, the only aristocratic color. For me, this is the ultimate. You can be quiet and it contains the whole thing. There is no color that will give you the feeling of totality, of peace, of greatness, of quietness, of excitement. I have seen things that were transformed into black, that took on greatness. I don't want to use a lesser word. And so Nevelson's use of black in her sculpture is intentional, but it feels like there's an added significance here. St. Mark's on the Bowery is the second oldest church in New York and a historic landmark. The fire that almost destroyed the church in 1978 gave rise to the Citizens to Save St. Mark's, and that fundraising group spawned the Landmark Fund, which helped restore and preserve the church as a historic landmark. And so Nevelson's use of Black is always rigorous, it's always thoughtful. But in this series, that Black recalls the church fire, ash, and becomes a kind of tribute to its resilience and survival as a space of community, spiritual practice, and historical structure. And this resonates for, I think, a lot of us in the Northeast, or those of us who have strong feelings about the idea of New York as a resilient space and a resilient city. And so Nevelson's work is in conversation with architecture and commemoration. Marie Watt's work, which is a new acquisition to PAFA, is also rooted in a conversation with New York architecture and commemoration, but it honors the labor that built the New York skyline. Watt is a member of the Seneca Nation, and her practice is often about indigeneity. According to Watt, in the early 2000s, I moved from the Brooklyn neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, to the Brooklyn borough of New York City, where the conifers and totem poles of my Pacific Northwest upbringing were replaced by skyscrapers and scaffolds. One interesting coincidence in moving to Brooklyn is that the border of Cobble Hill, where she lived, and Gowanus, where she kept her studio, is where the Iroquois ironworkers and their families settled in the 1950s. When most of Manhattan's skyscrapers were being built. These Iroquois were called skywalkers due to their ability to work on the high steel without safety harnesses. I am interested in the mythic and magical space that towers occupy. Skywalker skyscraper meditates on the human preoccupation with reaching this space and the long history of myths and stories that emanate from it. So Watt's monumental wall-based work is comprised of reclaimed wool blankets, and she notes that blankets are everyday objects that can carry extraordinary histories of use, and that in Indigenous communities, blankets are given away to honor those who are witness to important life events. She says, I am interested in how circles connect us through space and time, while being weary of how circles are used by corporate retailers. I am mindful that my circles intersect with others, ancient and modern. My circle is a shield, a flag, and a talisman. So Marie Watt has honored the difficult labor of men working on the hard metal and glass that realize an architectural vision in New York with something soft to the touch, filled with contemporary and historical symbolism and significance. Deborah Priestley is the series that we have in Taking Space is also about labor. And this labor is in service of the nation rather than a neighborhood or city. Drawn from a panoramic portrait found in her grandmother's collection of family photos, Somewhere Listening, Company B, is one of Priestley's keystone works. And I'm going to quote here. Describing the piece, she says, during a residency at the Marie Walsh Sharp, the space program, I created Company B, 365th Infantry Regiment, 92nd Division, AEF 1918 to 1919. It is an installation of 212 charcoal pencil portraits, measuring 28 by 29 inches. The vertical panels are displayed in a long horizontal grid that is 3 rows high. Deconstructed and enlarged, each portrait is surrounded by a 1-inch space. My intention is to prompt the viewer to pause and recognize each man as an individual. Collectively, the installation reconstructs the constructed panorama from which the portraits are drawn. Enlarged approximately 7 times in length from the original photo, this installation brings to light an African-American infantry, a Buffalo Soldiers division that was assembled from numerous states and sent into combat in France during World War I. I drew these portraits over the course of a year. The photograph in which my great uncle appears comes from my grandmother's archive. So while the scale is partly the point of this engagement, this piece is powerful because there are so many parts to the whole. The installation is made up of 212 drawings, and this is a staggering amount of work, of labor when you look at this installation. But each individual portrait is also a soldier unto himself, a man with a family, a home life, a past, and a vision for the future. And so Priestley and Watt both are using their work to highlight the gendered labor of others. Watts workers are skywalkers, indigenous men who risked their lives building New York's skyline by working the high rises, by building and constructing the high rises with their bodies, while Priestley's installation honors the Black men who offered their lives in service to the nation. Another installation that we're excited to debut in this exhibition is Ebony Patterson's Doing What They Always Do from her When They Grow Up series. There's a kind of physical and intellectual rigor, we think, to this kind of seriality, which is why it's a theme of the exhibition, to an artist's commitment to working through a concept over something like 20 sculptures or 212 portraits, or in this case, installation work. And so Patterson's When They Grow Up series asks us to see the subjects buried underneath these layers of laboriously applied, unusual materials as cherubic. These Black children are sort of framed in a kind of, you see these halos, a kind of sainthood that imbues them with a kind of innocence that we don't always get in media. And so this is from an installation that Patterson did at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 2016 that took up an entire room. Patterson said of this site-specific installation, I was thinking about those cases of the girls who were molested, thinking about the changes that happen with your body so rapidly. It pushes you into adult form, yet you're still a baby. What would it mean to put a child like that next to a child who is 16 and wearing a weave and very aware of her body? I was interested in these kinds of juxtapositions. When we think about stories like Trayvon Martin or Mike Brown, they were literally at the cusp of moving into adulthood. They were always talked about as if they were adults. But when we talk about Dylan Roof, who was 21, we talk about him like he was a kid. And so the piece that we have, photos of children who Patterson worked with models to construct this piece, are adorned with, on pink and white polka dot wallpaper. And the surfaces are covered with stickers, refrigerator magnets, Mardi Gras beads, appliques, books, plastic toys, handmade shoes, glitter, fabric. There's an idea that all of these materials that we think of as associated with childhood and childlike activities, fun, the reflectivity, light, you have balloons, you have balls, there are brooches, there are recreations of candy wrappers adorning the surface of this, all of these things that are hallmarks of a childhood that you don't necessarily think of as an artist material. And these are materials that Ebony Patterson overwhelms us with in this piece, covering the faces of these children with this confectionery, pop culture-like immersive space, forcing us to see these youth as youth. What you can't see in this image, and I should have included a close-up, is that when you look very, very closely through this incredible sort of reflective forestry, is that the close-up of a number of the children's faces have holes punched into them, almost like they're bullet holes. And Patterson frequently approaches this kind of subject matter, the subject of Black death, in this way, through this rigorous technique that harvests this mountain of materials and makes the glittery sort of fun space to draw us in, so that we have to look closely and we realize once we get right up on the structure that she's wanting us to consider what it means that she's commemorating a kind of a death this way. Alan Schatz is another piece we're happy to have in this exhibition, which was commissioned by PAFA in 2015. And this plane weave, which you're looking at now, is made of punched aluminum. And so here we have a kind of metal sculpture, which people normally think of as heavy, and it's suspended in midair so that it's meant to be light. And it's this rough, this hard material. You don't think of metal as something that you typically associate with a practice of light sculpture, physically light sculpture, or the kind of knitting together that Alison Schatz has done here. It also is meant to be installed in such a way that it reflects and throws the light into the window across the room. So like the idea that an artist would work in this material in this way to harness light and sort of flip on its head all of our expectations about how this material works, how we think of metal sculpture, the kind of work this can do in the world. And because this is a piece that is really fascinating to assemble and install, I have video that I am wanting to go to. Let me see if this will work. So you can see a bit how this installs. And so you're looking now at a time-lapse image of this installation going up at PAFA. I'm gonna jump a bit.
Yeah, Brittany, right now we can just see the Allison Shots image. I know, I think you have to go out of screen share and then share it again. I couldn't tell if it was that or if the screen was frozen. Sometimes videos are hard on Zoom, but
yeah. No, I realize now that that's, well, I'm gonna drop the video in the chat if that works for you, and hopefully you all will look at it later. But I do think that it requires a remarkable amount of labor to install, and so it's interesting to think through an artist making a work like that, sort of bringing that vision to life, like in the making process, knowing what it will take to show it, and to think about that as work. Okay, what are you seeing now?
So right now I can see the Allison Shots PowerPoint. So,
okay.
Yeah, and now we're back to where we were. And I can share the link since it's the one you sent me, right?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to be mindful of time. I'd love to have a robust discussion. There's another section of this exhibition that I would think of as a kind of work about work. I think that there's a lot of work in this exhibition where either the materials or the aesthetic, the artist's impulse in the work provides insights into how they make work and how they make an artful life or make room for themselves in the field. Almost in every work, it seems like there's a bit of, the piece is not just a piece itself, it's also a commentary on the field and their space in it. And so I'm starting with this Joan Brown self-portrait, which is something that Jody and I talk about often. Jody often talks about this Joan Brown self-portrait of her at work in her studio as being a kind of, it's almost like a Russian nesting doll of themes. It's sort of so rife with meaning. And so one of the things that's really amazing about this self-portrait is in it, you know, in the background image is another piece that Joan Brown had already painted. It's clearly a commentary on how people imagine that women artists work. And so she's poking fun at the idea that she, in 1907, will show up to a studio, a space that is incredibly messy. So you can see that there's paint all over the floor, and somehow she's in an A-line dress. She's in white shoes. She's in white gloves. This sort of fiction about who people imagine that women artists are and how they work becomes sort of a point of humor in the work that, you know, this is a moment where the field has not opened up for women artists and arguably still has not opened up to make an appropriate space for women artists to make work. But even thinking about how women artists make work, it's funny to sort of poke fun at the what must viewers, what must the establishment think that women are doing when they go into studio to make work. There must be this fantasy that, you know, this is how women go into the studio to make work, that it must be so different from the way that male artists make work. And there's a similar way that Makita Ahuja, in a real allegory of her studio, which is a piece that's really loved at PAFA, is doing this kind of artist self-portrait commentary. So in it, she not only inserts herself into the work, which insists that everyone who engages with her work will have to confront the reality of her body, of who she is as an artist and a maker in a world. But also that this is a piece that's engaged in a particular kind of citation politics that's really rife with meaning. The title is a riff on Courbet's The Painter's Studio painting. She's holding a textbook that is shows the ancient Egyptian statue known as the seated scribe, which was the source material for another painting of Ahuja's. And so this idea of sort of folding meanings on top of each other in a work is really fascinating, particularly for a woman of African-American and Indian descent to do it in a work like this. And as you can see from the scale of it, it's quite ambitious. And then there's Judy Gellis, who recently passed, and is a bit of the inspiration for this talk in a way. So we're showing 2 works from a portfolio that includes 6 different pieces. And this is from a family portrait series. And so in it, she makes her life the subject of her work. At the time, she was a young mother, and the series features photos of her family and these wry captions that narrate her life. And so on the left, the image of her in the bathroom, sitting on the toilet with 2 children is captioned, "I would love to be able to go to the bathroom alone." And on the right, this image dated March 3rd, 1979, has her looking at the TV, seated on the floor of a living room. And you can see in the background that there are papers strewn all over the floor, which I think is what a lot of our workspaces are looking like right now. And it's captioned, "On Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday afternoons, Jason is at nursery school and David naps. And I have 1.5 hours of free time to be creative and do important things." And this, I think, resonates with not only this current moment, but every moment of creative making and self-making, self-portrait watching the soaps. You know, this is Virginia Woolf insisting that a woman must have a room of her own to create fiction. This is, you know, drawing attention to the materiality of what it is to know oneself as an artist and to make work out of a need to make work. But what does that necessity look like in these moments where the material conditions have changed? And I actually think that there's something really fascinating and brave and deeply theoretical to make the constrained conditions both the subject of the work. So in this, rather than pretending that this is not happening, that she's not an overwhelmed young mother trying to make work and make a life, and figure out how to do those things sort of separately, that the worlds are sort of blending and coming together. So rather than pretend that that's not happening, like pull that into the work, make that the subject of the work in this way that forces us all to think about, well, what is it that we even think of as valuable about artists' work and how they make work? What is it that's acceptable to make the subject of the work, the material of the work? What kinds of genius do you get produced? What kinds of creative, you know, impulses do you get out of the necessity, out of the constraint? When you acknowledge that those material constraints are a very real feature of the work, how does that help us then apprehend, if I'm thinking with Helen Molesworth, what kinds of interpretive strategies do we need? How can we take seriously the material conditions of an artist's life as not only factor that structures their work, but also a feature of the work itself, and be inspired by the ambition they show when they lean into it and grasp it in that way and communicate that in the work and not necessarily just in the artist statement or in the interview. And likewise, Deborah Willis is doing a similar kind of work in this triptych, this lithograph, "I Made Space for a Good Man," which is made up of these series of photos of Deborah Willis, young and pregnant. And in it, so again, we have artist self-portraiture, and in the image, Each image is flanked by the first phrase, a woman taking space from a good man, as she reclines with her hands on her pregnant belly. The second image, flanked by the words, you took the space from a good man. And in this image, the sort of hands from a figure off screen or holding the belly. And in the final image, Deborah Willis is the reclining female nude, which is a standard art historical feature framed by the words, I made space for a good man. And when Deborah Willis talks about this lithograph, this image, the words, the two phrases on the beginning, on the first and third photos, are framing a center image that's in quotes, where she had this experience as a young art student in Philadelphia in the 1970s, where as a professor in one of her classes lamented that she was in the class because her presence in the class took the space from a good male student. And the presumption being that because she was in the room, that meant that there was another male student who wasn't going to be in the room. And instead, she, a young woman, was not going to have a consequential art historical future, that she was going to get married, that she was going to have children, that she was going to do this instead of becoming an artist of consequence. And that kind of lament is a story that we hear from a number of women artists about what it is to even be an artist in the world, to try to get into the field, to make work, to go to art school, to do things the proper way. And so there's something about if you think about what a young artist is doing in that moment, to sit in a room and have a professor in the field challenge, both her seat in the classroom, in the program, in art school overall, and in the field, in such an early moment, to lament already that there's a future that's not going to happen because she happens to be a woman. It's a really powerful thing for someone who became as accomplished as Deborah Willis did, as a photographer, a photo historian, a curator. She essentially established the field of Black photography. And here she is pregnant with her son, Hank Willis Thomas, who also became an artist and speaks really lovingly about what it means to be an artist in the world, the kind of future it enables to have parents who support an artistic practice because they understand it, because they take it, and because you're in a family that understands art and archiving. To sort of reclaim those words in the work in this way in 2009 is really sort of an important critique of the field, even though it's this quiet moment of reflection, it seems like, and joy in the photos on their own. To rework that and rework personal history into this lithograph becomes another kind of triumphant artistic production that I think is really worth considering. How much work, not just the work of photos into a lithograph, but also the conceptual work, the critique looking back of what it means to reclaim that moment and turn it into this kind of art that is so inspiring to look at every single time. And speaking of critique, we also were thinking with the Guerrilla Girls, the Guerrilla Girls portfolio at PAFA is rife with all of these really wry critiques that have been beloved in our field. Explicitly of the art industrial complex having so little space for artists who aren't white men. And so this isn't, for viewers who don't know, this is a group that formed as an activist anonymous collective in the 1980s that called themselves the Conscience of the Art World, and appear in public in guerrilla mass to keep the focus on the issues instead of artist identity. They use facts, humor, outrageous visuals to expose gender and ethnic bias, as well as corruption in politics, art, film, and pop culture. I'm quoting now, "We undermine the idea of a mainstream narrative by revealing the understory, the subtext, the overlooked, and the downright unfair. We believe in an intersectional feminism that fights discrimination and supports human rights for all people and all genders." And so we have this piece from the collection that we've been thinking about, the advantages of being a woman artist, where they list advantages like having an escape from the art world in your 4 freelance jobs, knowing your career might pick up after you're 80, not being stuck in a tenured teaching position, having the opportunity to choose between a career and motherhood, And all of this commentary is still valid. It's also remarkable to think about how many members of the Guerrilla Girls there have been. The fact that, for decades, this has been women artists. So I think a number of artistic heroes have been part of the Guerrilla Girls that we maybe haven't known about. But the fact that this is still like such a prescient moment to think about the kind of work that artists are doing anonymously as activists at the same time that they're building a practice and being critical of the field, that all of that work feels incredibly important. In a way that I think will continue to be if we can think about the kinds of art press that we're seeing in this moment of crisis. And so I'm mindful of time. I wanna stop and open it up for questions if I can, Abby. I'm really hoping to hear some feedback from folks. I'm hoping there are artists themselves on the call who just want to talk about what this brings up for them, how they're making work, how they're reconsidering work they've made in the past or reconsidering work that they're seeing.
Yeah, thank you, Brittany. And just a reminder for anyone who missed the beginning, we've asked you to virtually raise your hand. So the bottom of your screen, if you click on where it says participants, on the right-hand side, there'll be an option to raise your hand, or feel free just to like get our attention, drop things in the chat. We've already had some just great connections made with you, Natalia, for some of those. Yeah, we can hear from you. I think already getting some nice applause from people. Thank you. I know for me, and I'm curious what people are thinking about, but as an artist, I think it's so great to see the examples of women who are mothers and are navigating these different paths. That Deborah Willis is one of my favorites. I don't know about some of the people on the call, but when I was a young artist, I was actually told by an art mentor who was a woman that if I wanted to be successful, I shouldn't have kids. And so I think there's this sort sometimes where women also have kind of swallowed the patriarchy and or the pressures that we put on ourselves. And so I find it very inspiring to see women, like Judy Gels too, of navigating and actually taking these circumstances and celebrating them and exploring them and the difficulties too.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot with this work about how much art criticism and art writing I've seen from male reviewers on, sort of the idea of a woman's body of work or an offering that's about something like family or domesticity as being uninteresting or unambitious. And there's a way that I think that I think that's sort of ridiculous, especially if you consider how often people tell artists that they should make work about what they know. I mean, this is something that we see students having conversations about their work with faculty at PAFA all the time, that, you make your work about what you know. And if what you know and what's happening in your life is this right now, then it is something that it's absolutely reasonable to make this work about. But I also think particularly there's something about this pandemic that is really sort of shifting what we think of as interesting or necessary. I have a number of friends who are scholars, who are artists, who have small children or have given birth recently or are pregnant right now. And in this moment, I think, what's more ambitious than making people? I mean, like, the idea that you would make work about making people seems extraordinary to me now. I think there's something about this moment that has sort of brought that up in a way that I think women artists have constantly worked with. And I'm really fascinated by the idea that that is somehow not interesting, that that's somehow a subject that is provincial, even though humans have always done it. And even though it's extraordinary for every person every time you hear them talk about what that is and what that means.
Yeah, completely. So we have we have a question in the chat that I'd love to read the second half of. Thank you for that compliment. Dahlia was curious to hear more about how your exhibition explores the labor of Black women artists in particular. So thinking about, you already showed a diverse representation of race and ethnicity, but maybe specifically about the labor of Black women.
Yeah, I think we're profoundly lucky to have a body of work that lets us think about an artist, curator, scholar like Deborah Willis, who makes works about her body, and that being on view in this exhibition. That's not a standard part of her practice. She doesn't produce a lot of self-portraiture. So I like thinking with that piece and sort of her inserting herself into her practice as an artist and as a mother in that piece. At the same time that we think about Makita Ahuja's work with her body, she does frequently paint herself into her portraits. And she does a lot of nude self-portraiture in a way that reclaims, I think, the history of the female nude in art historical practice. There's, this wasn't on the on this slideshow, but we're showing two pieces by Mickaleen Thomas in the exhibition, and one is a piece that's frequently on view at PAFA. It's a large mixed media painting that's often on view in our historic landmark building. I believe it's up right now. And another is the small photo collage that is the basis of that piece. And in that piece, I think we really like thinking with, if we're thinking about scale, thinking about how an artist scales, sort of scaling as a verb. And so taking that kind of intellectual practice of how does Mickaleen Thomas go from this 6-inch by 8-inch photo collage where she works with a model, a sitter, a woman that she takes a series of photos of, and then blows this up, sort of, it becomes this over life-size mixed media piece where the figure then is adorned with all of, glitter and rhinestones and set up against a backdrop that features animal prints, and both the transition between mediums and the transition in scale is something that's really fascinating to us. The Ebony Patterson installation is similarly, I think, ambitious in its voracious use of materials to create a kind of immersive space as a jumping off point to think about, well, how is it that we are viewing the subjects of the photos? I mean, I think that what's fun about thinking all of that work together is that it lets us sort of jump into their intellectual practice and get into just how rigorous it is. I mean, all of these artists work incredibly rigorously with this work. I mean, they're really artist scholars in an incredibly straightforward way. If you think about, Deborah Willis is at NYU. All of these artists are teaching, practicing artists. I'm sensitive to the Guerrilla Girls sort of advantages of being a female artist. You don't have to worry about, being mired down in your tenure track job. But I think that there is a tradition of, there are a number of contemporary Black women artists who are working, who do have tenure track jobs at the moment. And that's also a huge anchor, I think, to their practice. You can see their intellectual rigor in their professional academic lives come out in their work in these really, I think, fascinating and rigorous ways.
Thank you for that question, Dahlia.
I love all those artists. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have someone who brought up a comment that they make nude self-portraits I think it's kind of a question about painting portraits of aging women and their friends and their wife. So thank you for sharing that. I think there's kind of a question in that about sort of the portrayal of, I know this was talking specifically about domestic labor, but there's so much involved in this of like the female body and the aging body. Is there anything kind of in the show that connects with that? Or I know that Jody's working on a project. I
was going to say, could we hear from Jody Throckmorton on that? I know this is part of our conversations about the Joan Semmel retrospective, often that we have a way of looking at artist self-portraiture and female bodies and nude female bodies in some really narrow ways that Joan Semmel has like pushed against and in a way that's incredible.
And before Jody jumps in, I think I kind of missed, Eileen had a question of who wants to look at that, which I think Joan Semmel and Jody, you'd have an answer to.
Hi. Yeah, in fact, the question of who wants to look at that is one of the reasons why I started thinking about the aging female body in art and even the aging male body in art, because I did an exhibition once that, it was an Eric Fischel exhibition that traveled to PAFA, I don't know how long ago, 10 years or so. And some of the paintings in the show had aged bodies on a beach, right? And they were incredibly beautiful. And one of the comments that I got from a visitor was, I don't want to come to a museum and see old naked bodies like mine. And so I always thought, there's the show, there's the title, Old Naked Bodies Like Mine, you know, because in that comment reveals so much about how it's really about us and what we're bringing to the artwork and what we're how we're seeing our aging selves in these bodies, perhaps. So yes, I'm doing a project with Joan Semmel that's coming up, her retrospective next summer, and she's 87. And she's continuing to this day, probably as we speak, to paint her nude 87-year-old body. And they're incredibly beautiful paintings and meditation on the disappearance of women and women's sexuality as they grow older, which I think is an incredibly important issue. And I have to say, I would love to see your work too. If you want to send, yeah, I would love to see your work. If you want to send me, my email's on the PAFA website, because there's other artists in Philadelphia that have been making that work as well. Someone I know that's doing large scale photographs, for example. So you're in good company. So I'm on the PAFA website, and send me an email. Thanks, Brittany, for the talk.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I also think that one of the things we love about artists is their ability to capture humanity, what is human about us. And so of course, like, what is more human than the aging body? I mean, aging is the thing that humans do if we do not die. I mean, and so the idea that we would only want to look at young bodies in fine art, that doesn't feel like art to me. That feels like advertising. That doesn't feel like humanity. I think we are interested in seeing the way artists approach humanity and capture humanity in their work. And so I think that's what makes that work so interesting. I mean, aging is a thing that we all will do, hopefully. And so there should be, I think, considerably more art about the aging human body than there is.
Yeah, and I think that's a lovely way to kind of end today's talk. So I wanted to thank Dr. Brittany Webb for being here and sharing that lovely presentation, and thank all of you for being here and being part of the PAFA from Home community. It's so nice to see all of you. I did want to put in a quick plug. I mentioned this at the beginning, that we do have a talk later today for all our artists out there. We have a community called The Artist Is In, and one of the subjects they're talking about today is space. So if you kind of want to take some of the threads that Brittany brought up about domestic spaces and the spaces that we're in now as artists, feel free to join that. I'm dropping a link in the chat. And also just check out our future programs. We've got Coffee and Culture later this week with Brooke Davis Anderson and Sid Sachs talking about his project Invisible City that was on view at PAFA, and some artists that will be very familiar to you, but maybe a story about Philadelphia that's not. So again, thank you, Brittany, and thank you to everybody. Stay safe. Feel free to unmute yourself to say goodbye. We'd love to hear from you, and take care.
This was wonderful.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for your question too. It was a great one.